So last week we finished up the bowl judgments of Revelation, and they culminated in the second coming of Jesus, the end of the world, and the inauguration of new creation. It was like the whole world kind of fell apart in a sense as Jesus returns in judgment. And while it was very brief in chapter 16, it was parallel to the other second comings of Jesus we saw with the seal and the trumpet judgments. But now we are getting into a new cycle of Revelation. Remember, there's 7 cycles of Revelation, and we just finished one in chapters 15 and 16, and now we are going to enter a brand new cycle in chapters 17 to 19. And what we're doing is we're going to be zooming in. John's vision now is going to zoom in very closely on that last trumpet. All right, on the 7th trumpet that we just studied. And we are going to get a very detailed explanation of what happens on the last trumpet. So we could summarize this section as the judgment of Babylon the prostitute. This is a slightly controversial section, to say the least, mattering how you interpret it. And let's just be honest, there's nothing PC about Revelation chapter 17 or even really chapter 18 or 19. So, in chapter 14, verse 8, what we're reading here was already announced. If you remember back, a few months back, we said it was like out of the blue. All of a sudden, Babylon's brought up. And in chapter 14, an angel says, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great." And we were saying, where did that come from? It was just briefly mentioned. And now we're getting the zoomed-in effect of it. The same thing during the bowl judgments we just studied. Remember in chapter 16, verse 19. Look there. The great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of the wrath of his rage. So, very clearly, we're zooming in now on that judgment of Babylon. John is having another vision, but this is not like the previous visions at all. There's something very unique about it. Now, who are the big players in these chapters? Well, very simple. We have a prostitute and we have a city, Babylon the Great. Or some translations say a harlot, and then the city Babylon the Great. And I want to just pause for a minute and say, let's think about what John is trying to tell us before we read the verses. There are major contrasts in the book of Revelation. Revelation is a book full of them. So, who is this great prostitute, this harlot, contrasted with in Revelation? What was that? The bride of Christ, right? We're about to see in chapter 19 the marriage supper of who? The Lamb. And then in chapter 21, we are going to see the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven to earth. And what does she look like? She's a bride adorned for her husband. So this prostitute that we're going to read about is very contrasted with the bride of Christ, the New Jerusalem. But we also see a city here, the city Babylon. Who is this city Babylon contrasted with? Also, another city, the final city, the New Jerusalem, the bride of the New Jerusalem. And there's a lot of other contrasts we've seen in this book, right? We've seen a lamb and a dragon. We've seen the Father's name put on the foreheads of his children, the beast's name, the mark of the beast, put on the foreheads of the beast followers. And now we have 2 women, a harlot and a bride, and 2 cities, Babylon and the New Jerusalem. So before we read, one more thing, Babylon. Let's talk about Babylon. If you're taking notes, your first blank, Babylon is mentioned 287 times in the Bible. That should stand out to you. 287 times. More times than any other city except the city of Jerusalem in Scripture. Babylon was a literal city. It was on the Euphrates River. That's going to be important. We're going to see the city described here as being on the waters. Where does the first mention of Babylon, where do you find it in the Bible? Genesis, where? I think I heard it. Tower of Babel, Genesis 11. It says there, we call it the Tower of Babel, but it actually says in Genesis 11 that the city where the tower was Babel, which is a shortened form of Babylon. And of course, that tower was an expression of rebellion against God. God says he brings judgment, he floods the earth. What does he tell the people to do? Be fruitful and multiply. And what did the people say? Nope. We're going to stay local, and we're going to build a tower so high the flood can't get us this time. And God says, nope, I'm going to let you babble, and I'm going to confuse you. So that's the first mention. Where is the second major emphasis of Babylon in the Bible? What was it? Nebuchadnezzar, right? So Daniel, the book of Daniel, what happens? Well, in the year 586 BC, the Babylonian Empire has defeated the Assyrian Empire, and now they march into Jerusalem. They take all of the elements from the temple, and they say, our gods are better than your God. And they destroy the city of Jerusalem in 722, and they take the Jews into exile. Babylon is not a good city in the Bible. It's always a city of rebellion against God. So, who is Babylon? That's the question. We're going to read about Babylon here. Who is it? Well, I believe that Babylon is a code name for the city of Rome for a lot of reasons. In fact, Peter, in his letter, as he is writing to the church, he talks about the saints who are in Babylon. And when he says that, there is no city of Babylon anymore, but he is talking about the Roman Empire and the capital city of Rome. It's a code word for that city. When we talk about Babylon, I think we can see here there is this harlot of Babylon that we're going to read about, and she sounds a lot like the Jezebel back in Revelation chapter 2. Do you remember that there was a Jezebel who was like prostituting herself in the churches? Remember that? She was seducing the people in the churches. And that is very similar to this language here in chapter 17. Now, some people have thought the Babylon we're going to read about is referring to the city of Jerusalem. And the reason why is because it talks about her committing fornication. So they think this must not be Rome. This is about the city of Jerusalem. I don't think that's correct, and we'll talk about why as we go forward. I think there's a lot of reasons why that's not correct. A third view that was very popular during the Reformation and still today is that this Babylon we're going to read about is the Roman Catholic Church. So some people have said this is symbolic of Roman Catholicism. And many Protestants say that the Pope is the Antichrist and that Babylon equals Roman religion, Roman Catholicism. Now, others see this city in a symbolic way, that Babylon represents not just Rome, which I think it does, but also represents all world powers, all kings, all rulers who have rebelled against Christ and have persecuted God's people. And I think if you think that view, you're on to something as we study chapter 17. So, what is very clear is just like God is building his city, the New Jerusalem, the demonic trinity, which is what? What is the demonic trinity we've seen in Revelation so far? The dragon, who else? The beast and the false prophet, right? The dragon, the beast. They're building a separate city, the city of Babylon. And that's why I say there's a sense in which it's also symbolic, rebelling against God. All right, that was a long intro, but I think it's important. So now let's read together Revelation 17, verses 1 through 6. It says, Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls, so notice the connection to the last chapter, came and spoke with me, saying, Come here, and I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed sexual immorality. And those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her sexual immorality. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, Then I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead a name was written. That's interesting, right? Because we've seen a lot of names on foreheads. It says, what? A mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. Then I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. When I saw her, I wondered greatly. And the angel said to me, why do you wonder? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. All right, parallel language, right? The bowl judgments happen. Now one of the angels involved in the bowl judgments comes. The 7 bowl judgments comes and says, come here and I am going to show you the punishment of, matter in your translation, the prostitute, the harlot, the old King James, very politically incorrect, the great whore, right? The great whore, that's the language there. In other words, she is not an ordinary prostitute. She's the queen bee of the hive, if you will. She's the great one. She is the one who stands out. Now, there's this huge contrast here. Come and I'm going to show you this great whore. In Revelation chapter 21, verse 9, when we see the bride of the New Jerusalem, what does it say? Come and I will show you the bride. The angel says that. So I think we're trying to get a contrast here. This woman and the bride of Christ are being contrasted. Now, this is not the woman of Revelation 12 that was chased by the dragon. If you go back, you remember that, right? That was the people of God. That was Israel of old and God's people today. This is an adulterous woman. This is a woman of fornication. Notice here the Greek word for prostitute. It's the word porne. It's where we get the word pornography from. This woman is not an adulteress. It's very important to say that. She has never been married to Christ. I want you to note that. She has never been married to Christ. The contrast here is between the prostitute and the Lamb's bride in Revelation 21. Now, who is this prostitute and who is the great city? Well, a few things about this woman. This harlot, notice it says here, she's at this great city and she sits on many waters. So this is a geographical mention, correct? A city that sits on many waters. Now, if you know the city of Jerusalem, does the city of Jerusalem sit on many waters? Nope. I've been there. Definitely not. There's a brook. There's a couple little, Hezekiah's tunnel has this little waterway underneath. There is no many waters anywhere near Jerusalem. It's very landlocked. Can't be Jerusalem, for one, because of this description. What city does sit on many waters? Well, it's very interesting when we think about Babylon and when we think about Rome. So first off, Babylon is described this way in the Bible. Someone read in your notes Jeremiah 51, verses 12 and 13.
Set up a standard against the walls of Babylon. Make the watch strong. Set up watchmen. Prepare the ambushes. For the Lord has both planned and done what he spoke concerning the inhabitants of Babylon. O you who dwell by many waters, rich in treasures, your end has come. The thread of your life has come.
Notice verse 13 says, Babylon dwells by many waters. I think that this vision John's having, he is seeing exactly the same thing that Jeremiah saw of the judgment of the city of Babylon. Because Babylon straddled the Euphrates River and had many canals. Now just a thought, if this city is a code, Babylon is a code for the city of Rome. Rome ruled the world, correct? And Rome is not just one city. Rome is what? Many cities. It is one city, but Rome's reach is all over the world. There's many waters. Every sea is controlled by Rome in this part of history. So, the many waters here are later explained in verses 15 and 18. Thankfully, we have a vision, and then when we read the next set of verses, we're going to see that God shows some mercy on us in Revelation, and he explains the vision a little more clearly than some of the others to help us interpret it. And I've actually tried to interpret the book using the explanations God gives. So later on in verses 15 and 18, we see that the waters represent the nations. Look in your Bible, verse 15. The waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are the peoples and crowds and nations and tongues. Notice that there. So clearly, these waters, while Babylon is the ruling city, these are the many nations of the world that it's representing here. So I like what Joel Beakey has said. He writes here, her clientele, the clientele of this prostitute, includes capitalists and communists, dictators and presidents, the rich and the poor. There is no system of government, no political ideology, and no human philosophy untainted by this woman. This woman has gotten into bed with all systems of the world. Her influence has impacted many waters, many political theories, and many nations. While Rome is our target city, I think that her influence is the world. Just like ancient Babylon controlled the world, so Rome controls the world. Notice it says in verse 2, the kings of the earth committed fornication with her, or sexual immorality with her. I think sexual immorality is a better translation because, again, she was never married to the groom. She is a prostitute. She is seducing and intoxicating. Now, we said earlier in the book that there is the beast and the false prophet. Does anyone remember what was the difference between the beast and the false prophet? Of course, there's differences in the way they appear in those visions, but one stood for one sphere and one stood more for another sphere. What were they? And you know it by the names. False prophet stands for what sphere? Religious. False prophet. Beast, more what? Political. Okay? Notice here that she has made them drunk with the wine of her fornication. She intoxicates kings and peoples, both politically and religiously. Now, there's a very famous quote from a man who was one of the dangerous men in the history of the world named Karl Marx. And Marx said, religion is the what of the masses? The opiate of the masses. And he was partially correct. Because empty religion is the opium of the masses, isn't it? Dead religion is. It lulls you. And he was right when he said that. And this woman has a false religion, a deceptive religion, that is intoxicating people and deceiving them. Now you'll notice in verse 3, as the vision progresses, it says, John says, the angel carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. So now he's telling us how he had this vision. Now, this is contrasted language. Usually, John is carried away, and where is he at in Revelation? He's in heaven, seeing the vision. But this vision is a profane vision. It's not a vision that you can see in heaven. It's a vision he sees in the wilderness, a far more appropriate place. Now, where has the wilderness been in this book? Well, in chapter 12, remember, the wilderness was a place of divine protection during tribulation. So, for instance, we saw the wilderness was the place where God protected Israel. The woman, where God protected what prophet in the Old Testament? Elijah. Remember, for 3.5 years, Elijah was protected in the wilderness. And, of course, Jesus spent time in the wilderness. And it is from the wilderness of this world that we can see what the world really is. When you're in the city, it's hard to see what you're in. But when you step out and you look in, guess what? You get a clear vision of what you're facing. So I always, one of my favorite things to do in years past was taking teams from our church from little Pensacola, 300,000 people, city of Pensacola, 50,000 people, over to New Orleans. And the first night we would go to New Orleans. By the way, I don't think New Orleans is a big city because I've been to big cities. But if you're only from Pensacola, New Orleans is a big city. I've taken a group many years ago from our church to New York City. and to Philadelphia and to Baltimore. And the comment I heard from most people was, well, that was my first and last trip there. They had enough. What I love to do, though, is take them to New Orleans. And the first thing I do is I take them down to Center City, right, to the historic district. And I walk them down around that cathedral down there, Café du Monde is, right, Jackson, and that court. And I let them see the darkness that is prevalent. And you know what? If you live in the city, you probably don't think anything of it, right? But if you got wilderness eyes and you see it, it's pretty shocking. So locals just walk right by it every day, never think anything of it. But you bring an outsider in and they see it, and it's shocking. So he's seeing this from the wilderness. And we saw that in Revelation 12, the wilderness. So what does he see? A woman, this prostitute, sitting on the scarlet beast. She is riding a beast, the beast we saw in Revelation 13 come up out of the water. The only difference between this description and chapter 13 is we see this beast's color. It is the color scarlet. So the woman and the beast are not identical in this vision. That's important to say. If she's riding the beast, what do you think that pictures?
Dominion over.
Control, support, right? She's supported. What she does is supported by the political power of the beast. And she seems to outwardly control the beast. Though we're going to see there's going to be a civil war, if you will, among evil in a little bit in this chapter. Now, what about the scarlet nature? So when we saw the dragon, the devil described back in chapter 12, what color was he? Anyone remember in Revelation 12, verse 3? He was red. Come on, you all know that. Every cartoon pictures the devil with a pitchfork and a red cape, right? That's where they got it from. The dragon, the devil, was red in that description. And now this beast has scarlet in color. So, there's a few ideas about this. This one, number one, this could be, scarlet was often and purple. Those two were the colors of wealth. And so this could be a symbol of her wealth, right? She's a prostitute. She's trying to outwardly adorn herself to deceive people with wealth. Some see it this way. I tend to think of this a little differently, though. I tend to think of this image that John is seeing standing for something else. What do you think it could be? Why scarlet? Blood. Because what does this chapter say about Babylon and the cup that she pours out? It's the blood of the saints, right? She is opposing God's people. She is killing God's people. She is taking the lives of Christians. And so I think when you read this, this is more of an allusion to the torture of Christians, the Inquisition, torture chambers, Christians as human torches, Christians in North Korea, Christians in the Islamic State, Christians in places like the Gaza Strip, right, where they're losing their lives for the sake of the gospel. It's interesting when you read a little later down in Revelation 17, verses 16 and 17. It says there, the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. So this is a temporary arrangement, right? It seems like this woman and the beast are getting along, but one day they're going to turn on each other at the end when Jesus returns. This isn't going to last forever. Now, John Wallnofer has written here, her position, riding the beast, indicates on the one hand she's supported by the political power of the beast, and on the other that she has a dominant role, at least outwardly, and is directing the beast. I think that's a good way to think about this picture. So the point here is that when you read something like this, is that they're going to turn on each other. False worship is destructive, right? False religion and world powers, they can look like they go along together, but ultimately they always turn on each other. Don't put your trust in princes, the Bible says. Don't put your trust in riches, the Bible says. Why? Because they don't last. All right? Look, we're already about to start politics season, okay? And they've already given us possibly the worst choices, again, in the history of American politics, right? And don't put your trust in politics. Don't do it. Choose the best you can, but don't put your faith there. That's not where you need to go. So, and be wary of fake religion mixed with politics. Fake religion, because we get deceived all the time with fake Christians. There's no doubt. Now, notice the woman is arrayed in purple and scarlet, and she's adorned with gold and precious stones. Again, she's a prostitute. This symbolizes great power, great wealth, prosperous life. In fact, it was common for prostitutes in Rome to wear a headband with their name engraved on it. And I like what one commentator says, in spite of all this beauty, she's still just a prostitute. Don't be deceived. This is like the Proverbs woman, right? The harlot. Don't be deceived. It may look good on the outside, but all that glitters is not gold. Okay? Don't be deceived by this. Now, some have seen this as argument that this is the Roman Catholic system. Some Protestants read language like this and they say, this is the cathedrals, the rites, the ceremonies, the golden vessels, the vestments, the pomp, the circumstance. I'm not so sure that that's what is at all being referred to here. I think this is more picturing her as a prostitute and the danger of financial mixing with religion, right? The love of money is the root of what? All kinds of evil, and some have what? Swerved from the faith, departed from the faith, made shipwreck of their faith. So be wary. Just because it looks beautiful doesn't mean it is beautiful. I think that's more the idea here. Notice she has in her hand a golden cup full of abominations. Again, Jeremiah, the prophet, chapter 51, verse 7. Someone read that, please.
Babylon was a golden cup in the Lord's hand, making all the earth drunken. The nations drank of her wine, therefore the nations went mad.
So the disgusting brew in her cup, it may taste good at first, but it leaves you intoxicated. It leaves you mad. It drives her lovers crazy. This is insanity. If you follow evil, you're going to end up like Nebuchadnezzar, right? You're going to end up wild, like an animal, right? This is dangerous. And by the way, turn on the news and don't tell me we haven't lost our minds. Correct? This is what happens to a nation that rejects Christ, rejects His law, rejects His word. They are now drinking a cup of abominations. Woe unto those who call evil good and good evil. That's exactly what we see today. Now again, some commentators are going to refer this to Roman Catholicism and say that this cup represents indulgences and the veneration of Mary and prayers to the saints, the treasury of saints, and the bowing and adoration to relics and all this kind of stuff. You may be able to apply some of this as false. I think those things are false religion. I'm not sure that's what John, though, has in mind here. That's what I want to say. So I'm not saying that those things aren't wrong and false religion, for sure. Our cathedral in town has supposedly a piece of the cross, and I think it's either a hair or a fingernail of Mother Teresa. I can't remember, but it has that on display at certain times of the year, and other relics that are venerated. I don't think that's Christianity. All right? That's not what God had in mind when He talks about faith, and even the faith of the saints and the Hall of Heroes of Faith and things like that. So, but I don't think that's what John's really talking about. So let's just be careful, because that's still a little bit of newspaper exegesis, right? That's just seeing something kind of out there today and saying, this is a direct apples-to-apples comparison. I don't think it is. Now notice, the city here and the drink is called Babylon the Great, right? Symbolizing the entire world's opposition to God. Just like the Tower of Babel was great in opposition to God. So, who is this Babylon? Well, I think John clearly, when he says Babylon, he is talking about the imperial city of Rome. Because you'll notice in verse 9, look there what it says. The 7 heads are the 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Do you see that? We're going to talk about that in a minute. The city of Rome is famous for sitting on 7 hills. Then you go to the end of the chapter, and we're going to talk about this in more detail next week. Look at verse 18. The woman who you saw is the great city, is the great city, which has, that's present tense in Greek, a kingdom over the kings of the earth. When John writes that, he says, this is the city which presently has a kingdom over the kings of the earth. That's Rome. So clearly, I think the vision John's seeing is one of Rome. But there's more to it than that. Now, we'll get into that in a moment. Now, notice what it says here in verse 5. Babylon the mystery, Babylon the great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations. So what she drinks and what she sells, everything she does is an abomination. It is the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. Babylon is an embodiment of this. This is like if you've read The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, one of the great literary classics. All right, when John Bunyan is traveling, he goes through a town. Does anyone remember what that town is called? What was that? Vanity Fair, right? Of course, led there by worldly wise men, right? Pointed in that direction to this town of Vanity Fair. This is Vanity Fair in the Pilgrim's Progress. This is where, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, the embodiment of that is happening there. And unfortunately, that's like many cities in the world, isn't it? Not just Rome at all. Now, again, some see this as the Roman Catholic Church. And I'm going to read you what John Wesley wrote from his era so you can hear it. He writes there that Benedict XIII, the Pope, was, in his proclamation of the Jubilee in AD 1725, that's Wesley's, close to his contemporary there, explains this sufficiently. His words were, "This Catholic and apostolical Roman Church is the head of the world, the mother of all believers, and the faithful interpreter of God, and the mistress of all churches." So it is said that Rome has kind of adopted some of this language. But now, I want to be fair, right? Because some of the church fathers talked about the church as the mother and things like that. And I don't think they meant it in the Babylon sense. But understand that a lot of Protestants talked this way and saw this as a fulfillment this way. I'm going to kind of lay off that theme now. I just wanted to give you kind of some of the arguments for why some think it is the Roman Catholic Church. We'll talk more about it in a little bit. At the end of the day, verse 6, what is she intoxicated with? The blood of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus. She is opposing God's people. Just like the beast in chapter 11 killed who? Who did the beast kill in chapter 11? The two witnesses, that's right. And then in chapter 13, the beast made war with who? It's in your notes. 13:7. Someone read 13:7.
Also, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them, and authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation.
Thank you. So the beast makes war with the saints. So clearly, she's opposed to the true church. By the way, this is why we have to remember there is the visible church and the invisible church. Not everyone who says they're a Christian is a Christian. Not everyone who says they know God knows God. And so she's very religious. This whole thing is very religious looking, but it's not Christian at all. It's apostate. It's false. So we have just a few minutes left here, not much time. But I want us to just start the next section and go as far as we can. Because now the angel is going to interpret this in greater detail. Now, John says when he sees this, he's amazed. That's what he says. Just like Daniel, when he saw his visions, he says he was amazed or astonished in Daniel chapter 4. And I think there's some parallel here. So let's keep reading. Let's pick up at verse 7 and read just a little bit farther. The angel said to me, "Why do you wonder? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to come up out of the abyss and go to destruction. And those who dwell on the earth, whose name had not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will wonder when they see the beast that he was and is not and will come. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits, and they are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, one is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must remain a little while. And the beast which was and is not is himself also an eighth, and is one of the seven, and he goes to destruction. And the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but they receive authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. They have one purpose, and they give their power and authority to the beast. These will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called an elect, and they are faithful. Stop right there. So, the angel says, why are you marveling, John, as you see this? I'm going to explain the mystery to you. This beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns, what is this all about? What does this stand for? Well, verse 8 is a little parenthetical thought. The beast that you saw was and is not and will ascend out or will come up. So this is the beast that we just read about in verse 3, that we read about in chapter 13. Now it's very interesting. We have said Satan parodies Christ in this book. So remember, the beast tries to look like the lamb, right? Notice here the parody. What does the Bible say in Revelation about God and about Jesus? He is, he was, and what? He is to come. We've heard that a few times in this book. In chapter 1, verse 4. God is him who is and was and who is to come. Jesus is him who is and was and is to come. And now the beast is described the same way. He's a what? Another Christ. Anti, the prefix anti, can mean against, or it can mean another, a copycat, a wannabe. What did Jesus say? In the last days there will be many false Christs and false prophets, and they will deceive many. So he was, and he is not, and yet he's going to ascend out. Remember what happened in chapter 13. Remember in chapter 13, verse 3 and 12, there, very important. I'll read it to you. It says, one of the heads had been like it was slain fatally, but his fatal wound was what? He was healed. It was like he died, but he came back to life. Do we know anyone who died and came back to life? Jesus, right? False Christ. Do you see that? False Christ. And notice who worships him. The ones whose names are not written in the book of life from when? Foundation of the world. The saints are secure in their salvation, not because of what they do or who they are, but because of God's work, even from the foundation of the world. Only the saints' names are in the book of life from the foundation of the world. Remember earlier in Revelation, God said, I will not blot your name out of the book. Unlike the wicked rulers who would blot Christians' names out of the deeds of the city and take their property away. God says, I will never, ume, it's a double negative in Greek. It's impossible for me to take your name out. Your name was written from before the foundation of the world. So, here is wisdom, right? We heard that earlier, back in chapter 13 in the mark of the beast. Here is wisdom. Understand the mark of the beast. What is this wisdom about? The 7 heads are the 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Okay, very clearly here, Rome is the city that has dominion over the kings of the earth, that sits on 7 hills. All right, the 7 heads symbolize the hills and the kings who Rome controls. Some people think these are 7 different emperors. Some people think these are 7 different nations. I think far more likely this language is collective for all governments that oppose God and Christ until the final government, the empire of the Antichrist, right? The empire of that last world system. And by the way, it doesn't have to be the United Nations. It doesn't have to be the European Union. It doesn't have to be some future collective body. It is literally all kings who war against Christ at the end. All right, we have to stop thinking, oh, this has to be X, Y, or Z. This is communism. This is a coalition or something. No. This is a coalition. It's a coalition of those who oppose Christ and his people. That's what it's a coalition of. And Jesus is going to deal with them one day. But guess what? If your name is written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, you're God's people. You're safe. That's what matters. It is the Lamb's book of life, right? You're covered by the blood of Christ. You're different. I wanted to get a little farther, but we're going to stop right there. I think it's good that we stop because there's so much more to say. And we will pick up again next week and try to finish up chapter 17.